When I came home after 3 weeks away, helping my best friend recover from surgery, the first thing I noticed was the empty space in my garage. My husband's 1967 Ford Mustang was gone. I thought it had been stolen. Then my daughter Melissa looked me straight in the eye and said, "Don't worry, Mom. We sold it for you." Sold it. The car my late husband Robert and I had spent decades restoring together. My son-in-law nodded proudly. My grandson smirked from the kitchen doorway. What they didn't know was that 23 days earlier, I had quietly transferred the title out of my name. And within the next 48 hours, their little secret was about to become a very expensive mistake. Before I tell you what happened, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever had a family member make a major decision behind your back and call it helping? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about family resilience and standing up for yourself no matter your age, please take a moment to like and subscribe. I always enjoy seeing where everyone is watching from, so tell me your city, state, and what time it is there right now. My name is Geraldine Cruz. I'm 67 years old, widowed, and until recently I believed that the people closest to me would never intentionally hurt me. Looking back now, I realize how wrong I was. I live in a quiet neighborhood outside Dayton, Ohio. It's the kind of place where people still wave from their porches and where neighbors notice when a car pulls into a driveway. I've lived in the same house for nearly 40 years. Every corner of that house carries a memory of my husband, Robert. Robert and I were married for 42 years before cancer took him away. Even now, 5 years after his death, I still catch myself reaching for the other side of the bed some mornings. Some habits never leave you. Neither do certain memories, especially the ones attached to a car. Most people saw a faded blue 1967 Ford Mustang sitting in my garage. They saw an old vehicle, an antique, something that took up space, something that could be sold. But when I looked at that Mustang, I saw my life. Robert bought it when he was 23 years old. Back then, it wasn't a collector's item. It was just a used car that a young mechanic could barely afford. He used to laugh whenever he told the story. The engine was better than the paint, he'd say, and the paint wasn't saying much. A year after we got married, he drove me across 3 states in that car for our honeymoon. No air conditioning, no GPS, no fancy hotels. Just 2 young people in love and a Mustang that rattled every time it hit 50 miles per hour. Those were some of the happiest days of my life. Years later, when our daughter Melissa was born, Robert installed a tiny child seat in the back. When she was 5, she'd sit in the garage pretending to drive while Robert worked on the engine. She used to call it Daddy's race car. I still remember her giggling. I still remember her begging for rides every Sunday afternoon. That's why what happened later hurt so much, because she knew exactly what that car meant. As Melissa grew older, life changed. She got married to Brian Carter. At first, I liked him. He was charming, confident, hard-working. At least that's how he appeared. Over time, though, I started noticing cracks. Brian always seemed to have a new financial problem, a failed investment, a business opportunity that didn't work out, credit card debt, loans. There was always something. Melissa often defended him. "He's trying, Mom. Things are tough right now. Everyone struggles sometimes." And I believed her. Maybe because I wanted to. Maybe because mothers always hope for the best. Then there was my grandson, Ethan. For most of his childhood, Ethan was the light of my life. After Robert died, Ethan spent many afternoons helping me around the house. We planted flowers together, watched baseball games, shared milkshakes at the diner downtown. For years, I believed he had inherited Robert's kindness. But people change. especially when they're surrounded by the wrong influences. The first time I felt uneasy was about a year before everything happened. Ethan came into the garage while I was cleaning the Mustang. He walked around it slowly, examining every detail, running his hand along the paint. "Grandma," he asked, "how much do you think this thing is worth?" The question caught me off guard. "I don't know," I said. "Enough to matter." I laughed. "Why would that matter?" He shrugged. "Just curious." But his eyes lingered on the car, not with affection, not with nostalgia, with calculation. I noticed it. I just didn't understand it yet. A few months later, Brian brought up the Mustang during dinner. "You know," he said casually, "classic car prices are crazy right now." Melissa nodded. "I read that some of them sell for 6 figures. I immediately felt uncomfortable. Robert and I had never talked about the car in terms of money. To us, it was family history, not an asset, not an investment. A memory. "I have no interest in selling it," I replied. The room became quiet. Then Brian smiled. "Of course not." But something about that smile felt wrong. The subject kept coming up after that, again and again. Sometimes Melissa would mention how expensive maintenance was. Sometimes Brian would talk about insurance costs. Sometimes Ethan would ask questions about classic car auctions. Each conversation seemed harmless on its own. Together they felt like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't quite solve. One Saturday afternoon, I found Melissa standing alone in the garage. She was staring at the Mustang. When she noticed me, she jumped slightly. "Oh," she said, "I didn't hear you. What are you doing?" She forced a smile. "Just looking." At the car. For 10 minutes it felt strange, but I let it go. I wish I hadn't. Because around that same time, another thing started happening. Brian began asking questions about my finances, questions he had never asked before. Did I have a will? Was the house paid off? Who handled my legal paperwork? What would happen if I couldn't drive anymore? At first I assumed he was concerned. Now I know better. Those weren't questions born from care. They were questions born from opportunity. The most painful part is that I kept giving them the benefit of the doubt. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself family deserved trust. I told myself Robert would want me to believe the best in people. Maybe that's true. But Robert was also a mechanic. And mechanics understand warning signs. They know when something sounds wrong under the hood, even before it completely breaks down. One evening, while sitting alone in the garage, I found myself staring at the Mustang. The setting sun reflected off the windshield. For a moment, I could almost hear Robert's voice. I remembered something he used to say. "Pay attention to small things, Jerry. The small things become big things." At the time, I thought he was talking about engines. Years later, I realized he was talking about people too. And suddenly, all those little moments started replaying in my mind. The questions, the conversations, the looks, the interest in the car, the focus on money, the strange behavior. Something wasn't right. I couldn't prove it. I couldn't explain it. But deep down, I felt it. And that feeling became impossible to ignore. I had no idea then how far my own family was willing to go, but the warning signs were already there, and before long I would make a decision that would change everything, a decision that would save Robert's Mustang from the people who claimed they loved me most. The older I get, the more I've learned to trust my instincts. Not because I'm wiser than everyone else, not because I expect the worst from people, but because life has taught me that when something feels wrong, it usually is. The trouble is that sometimes your heart fights against what your instincts are trying to tell you. Mine certainly did. I didn't want to believe my daughter's son-in-law and grandson could be looking at Robert's Mustang as anything more than a cherished family heirloom. I wanted to believe they respected what it meant to me. I wanted to believe love mattered more than money. For a while, I convinced myself that was true. Then the warning signs became impossible to ignore. A few weeks after that conversation about classic car prices, Melissa stopped by unexpectedly on a Tuesday morning. I was watering flowers on the front porch when she pulled into the driveway. "Mom," she called cheerfully. That alone surprised me. Melissa wasn't usually cheerful before noon. She came inside carrying coffee and pastries. For nearly an hour, she chatted about ordinary things. Work, the weather, a neighbor's new dog. It all felt unusually pleasant. Then almost casually, she said, "Have you thought any more about giving up driving?" There it was again. The subject I had hoped was finished. "I'm fine driving," I answered. "You're 67. I smiled. And Melissa sighed dramatically. "Mom, things happen." "What things? Accidents, health problems, slower reaction times." I stared at her. "Melissa, your father was still driving that Mustang at 72. That was different." "No," I said quietly. "It wasn't." Her smile faded. The conversation ended soon afterward. But as I watched her leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that the visit had never been about coffee. A week later, Brian stopped by. He claimed he needed help moving some paperwork. While we sat at the kitchen table, he suddenly asked, "Do you still have all the original documents for the Mustang?" The question hit me like a cold splash of water. I kept my expression neutral. "Why? No reason?" I waited. Brian laughed awkwardly. "I was just curious." Curious. That word again. Everyone seemed curious lately. "The documents are safe," I replied. "That's good." He quickly changed the subject, but my uneasiness grew. That evening I sat in the garage longer than usual. The Mustang gleamed beneath the overhead light. Robert had spent years restoring every inch of it. The engine, the chrome, the upholstery. Sometimes I would sit in the driver's seat and simply remember the man who loved that car almost as much as he loved me. I ran my hand across the steering wheel. Something about the situation bothered me deeply. People don't suddenly become fascinated by paperwork unless they have a reason. The next warning sign came from Ethan, and that one was harder to ignore. One Saturday afternoon, he volunteered to help me organize old files in my home office. That wasn't unusual. Ethan had helped me with projects before. For several hours, we sorted through boxes, old tax records, insurance documents, family photographs. Everything seemed normal. Then I noticed something. He paid special attention whenever vehicle paperwork appeared. More than once, I caught him glancing at folders labeled automobile. At one point, he even asked, "Grandma, where do you keep the important originals?" I looked up. "The originals of what?" "Just stuff." "What stuff?" He shrugged. "You know, house papers, car titles, things like that." My stomach tightened. I smiled politely. "Safe places," he laughed, but his eyes didn't. That night I barely slept. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe not. The following week brought another strange incident. I was preparing to run errands when I opened the drawer where I kept spare keys. Something felt off immediately. The drawer looked exactly the same. Yet something wasn't right. I counted, then counted again. The spare key to the Mustang was missing. At first, I assumed I had misplaced it. I searched the kitchen, the garage, my purse, every jacket pocket I owned. Nothing. The key had vanished. I sat at my dining room table staring into space. Robert used to joke that nobody could steal the Mustang because I guarded those keys like crown jewels. Now one of them was gone. I called Melissa. "Have you seen the spare Mustang key?" A brief silence followed. Then she answered, "No." Something about her tone felt rehearsed. "Why?" "I can't find it." "Maybe you misplaced it." Maybe. But I didn't think so. After we hung up, I felt more unsettled than before. The next morning, I went looking through my filing cabinet. That's when I discovered something even worse. The folder containing copies of my vehicle documents had clearly been disturbed. Not stolen, not missing. Disturbed. Papers sat in the wrong order. A receipt that belonged near the back appeared near the front. A registration document was upside down. Tiny details. Details most people wouldn't notice. But I noticed, because I had organized those files myself, and because I was absolutely certain I had not moved them. I sat there for several minutes, thinking, replaying recent events, Melissa's questions, Brian's interest in paperwork, Ethan's curiosity, the missing key, the disturbed file. For the first time, a frightening possibility entered my mind. What if this wasn't random? What if these incidents were connected? The thought made me physically sick. I hated myself for even considering it. These were my family members, my daughter, my grandson, people I loved. But love doesn't erase facts, and the facts were beginning to pile up. Over the next few days, I became more observant. I started paying attention to conversations, to expressions, to little things, and what I noticed troubled me. Whenever the Mustang came up, Brian seemed unusually focused. Whenever money came up, Melissa looked stressed. Whenever both topics appeared in the same conversation, Ethan became very interested. One evening, I overheard part of a discussion in my kitchen. They didn't know I was approaching. "Worth a lot more than she thinks," Brian said. I froze. Then Melissa answered, "What if she refuses?" "Refuses what I stepped into the room before I could hear more." The conversation stopped instantly. All three faces turned toward me. Nobody spoke. Nobody smiled. The silence lasted only a few seconds. But it felt much longer. That was the moment something changed inside me. Not anger, not fear. Awareness. For months, I had been explaining away every warning sign. Now I couldn't. The pattern had become too obvious. I still didn't know exactly what they were planning, but I knew there was a plan. And I knew Robert would never forgive me if I ignored the signs. 3 days later, I received a phone call that would ultimately save me. My lifelong friend Patricia Dawson had undergone surgery in Michigan. Her recovery wasn't going well. She needed help. Could I come stay with her for a few weeks? Of course I said yes. Patricia had stood beside me through some of the hardest moments of my life. I wasn't about to abandon her. But after I hung up the phone, another thought entered my mind. I would be leaving my house unattended. Leaving the Mustang unattended. Leaving my family with access to both. For reasons I couldn't fully explain, the idea made me uneasy. Very uneasy. That afternoon, I sat alone in the garage. The Mustang sat quietly before me. Sunlight streamed through the windows. For a moment, I imagined Robert standing beside me. And once again, I remembered his words. "Pay attention to small things, Jerry. The small things become big things." I looked at the car. Then I made a decision. A decision that seemed unnecessary at the time. A decision I told nobody about. Within days, I would visit the one person I trusted completely, Attorney Samuel Bennett, and together we would put protections in place that my family never saw coming. Protections that would eventually turn their entire scheme upside down. The morning after I decided something needed to be done, I woke up before sunrise. I couldn't explain why. Perhaps it was anxiety. Perhaps instinct. Or perhaps it was the voice of experience reminding me that trouble rarely announces itself before it arrives. The house was silent. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table staring out the window. The Mustang sat in the garage where it had always been. Safe. At least for the moment. I should have felt comforted by that. Instead, I felt urgency. The phone call from Patricia Dawson the previous day kept replaying in my mind. Patricia and I had been friends for nearly 50 years. We had raised children together, celebrated birthdays together, cried together when we buried our husbands. If she needed help recovering from surgery, there was no question that I would go. The problem wasn't leaving. The problem was what I would be leaving behind. For the first time, I found myself wondering whether my family viewed my absence as an opportunity. That thought hurt more than I can describe. No mother wants to think that way. No grandmother wants to believe it. But after everything that had happened over the previous months, I couldn't completely dismiss the possibility. By 10 o'clock that morning, I had made up my mind. I picked up my purse and drove downtown. Not to the grocery store, not to the pharmacy. I drove straight to the office of Samuel Bennett. Samuel had been our family attorney for over 20 years. Robert trusted him completely. So did I. His office occupied the second floor of a brick building near the courthouse. The waiting room hadn't changed in decades. Same wooden furniture, same framed photographs, same smell of old books and coffee. When the receptionist saw me, she smiled warmly. "Mrs. Cruz, it's good to see you." "You too, Linda." A few minutes later, Samuel appeared. He was in his early 70s now, gray-haired, sharp-eyed, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke. "Geraldine," he said, shaking my hand. "What brings you here?" I wasn't entirely sure how to answer, because what I needed wasn't exactly legal advice, at least not yet. What I needed was reassurance. Instead, I told him the truth, every bit of it. Melissa's questions, Brian's interest in paperwork, Ethan's strange behavior, the missing key, the disturbed files, the conversations that stopped when I entered a room. Samuel listened without interrupting. Not once. When I finally finished speaking, he leaned back in his chair. For several moments he said nothing. Then he asked a question. "Do you trust them?" The simplicity of the question surprised me. I stared at him. "I want to." "That's not what I asked." I looked away. The silence felt uncomfortable. Because I already knew the answer. "No," I admitted quietly. Samuel nodded. Not with judgment, not with surprise, just understanding. "Then let's discuss how to protect yourself." My heart sank. Hearing those words made everything feel more real. Until that moment, part of me still hoped I was imagining things, that I was being overly cautious, that none of my concerns were justified. But Samuel wasn't treating them as imagination. He was treating them as warning signs. "What exactly do you want to protect?" he asked. "The Mustang," I answered immediately. "Not the house, not my savings, not my retirement accounts. The Mustang, because that was what seemed to attract everyone's attention." Samuel folded his hands together. "Tell me why." So I did. I told him about Robert, about our honeymoon, about restoring the car together, about what it meant to me, and about the growing suspicion that certain people in my family saw it as something entirely different, something with a price tag. When I finished, Samuel nodded slowly. "There are several options." He explained them carefully. Some involved changing ownership structures. Some involved additional legal protections. Others involved creating a trust. As he spoke, one particular option stood out: a memorial trust, a legal entity that could own the vehicle independently, one that would remove the Mustang from my personal ownership while preserving complete control over its future. The more he explained it, the more sense it made, especially after what I had experienced. "If I do this," I asked, "would anyone know?" Samuel smiled slightly. "Not unless you tell them." That answer stayed with me, because for the first time in months, I felt something I hadn't felt before. Relief. Not complete relief, but enough. Enough to breathe. Enough to think clearly. Enough to stop feeling powerless. We spent the next hour reviewing documents, paperwork, ownership records, vehicle title information. Everything had to be completed properly. Everything had to be legal. Everything had to be airtight. If there was one thing Robert respected, it was doing things the right way. By the time we finished, Samuel had prepared the necessary paperwork. The trust would be named the Robert Cruz Memorial Trust. The name alone nearly made me cry. I imagined Robert laughing if he could see all this, not because it was funny, because he would have appreciated the irony. The old mechanic who never trusted shortcuts would have loved the fact that his beloved Mustang was now protected by pages of legal documents. Before signing, I hesitated. The pen hovered above the paper. Suddenly, the reality of what I was doing hit me. This wasn't about a car. This was about family. This was about acknowledging a possibility I never wanted to face. The possibility that the people closest to me might not always act in my best interests. My hand trembled slightly. Samuel noticed. "You're doing the right thing." I looked at him. "How do you know?" "Because protecting yourself doesn't mean you're accusing anyone." He paused. "It means you're prepared if you're right." Those words gave me the strength to sign. One signature, then another, then another. Within minutes, it was done. Legally and officially. The Mustang no longer belonged to Geraldine Cruz. It belonged to the Robert Cruz Memorial Trust. I left Samuel's office carrying copies of the paperwork. For some reason, the sky looked brighter. Maybe because I felt lighter. Or maybe because I knew I had finally listened to my instincts. On the drive home, I stopped at the cemetery. I hadn't planned to, but it felt right. Robert's grave sat beneath a large oak tree. I brought fresh flowers and sat beside the headstone. For a while, I simply talked, the way I often did. I told him about Patricia, about my upcoming trip, about Melissa and Brian, about Ethan, and finally about the trust. I laughed softly. "You'd probably tell me I watch too many crime shows." A breeze moved through the trees. For a brief moment, I felt strangely peaceful, as if Robert approved, as if he understood, as if he had always known this day might come. 3 days later, I packed my bags. Patricia needed me. The trip to Michigan would last several weeks. Melissa stopped by before I left. She hugged me, asked me to be careful, told me not to worry about anything at home. Brian called and offered to check on the house while I was gone. Even Ethan volunteered to help if anything came up. To anyone else, it would have sounded thoughtful, supportive, loving. But something about their eagerness unsettled me. I smiled anyway, thanked them, said all the things a mother is supposed to say. Then I climbed into my SUV and began the drive north. As Ohio disappeared behind me, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For reasons I couldn't explain, I had the feeling that events were already beginning to move, like pieces on a chessboard. And somewhere behind me, people who believed they had a perfect plan were preparing to make their move. What they didn't know was that the game had already changed, 24 hours earlier, inside a lawyer's office, with a single signature. And soon that signature would destroy everything they thought they had arranged. While I was helping Patricia recover in Michigan, I tried very hard not to think about Ohio, not because I didn't miss home. I did, every day. But Patricia needed me, and focusing on her gave me something positive to hold on to. Her surgery had been more complicated than expected. For the first week, she needed help with nearly everything: preparing meals, managing medications, getting around the house. The routine kept me busy, and for a while it distracted me from the uneasy feeling I had carried with me when I left. Still, that feeling never completely disappeared. Sometimes late at night after Patricia had gone to sleep, I would sit by the window with a cup of tea. The house would be quiet, the streets empty, and my thoughts would drift back to Ohio, back to Melissa, back to Brian, back to Ethan, back to the Mustang. Several times I almost called Samuel Bennett just to make sure everything was in order. Each time I stopped myself. The trust had been established properly. The paperwork was secure. There was no reason to worry. At least that's what I kept telling myself. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, events were unfolding exactly as I had feared. I wouldn't learn all the details until later. Some came from legal documents. Some came from security footage. Some came from admissions made after everything fell apart, but eventually I pieced together the entire story. And when I did, it was even worse than I imagined. 3 days after I left Ohio, Brian invited Melissa and Ethan over for dinner. According to Ethan's later statement that dinner wasn't really about family, it was about money. Brian's financial problems had become far more serious than anyone realized. His failed investments had left him buried in debt. Credit cards were maxed out. Personal loans were overdue. Collection agencies had started calling. Melissa knew about some of it, not all of it. Brian had been hiding the worst details, but by then both of them were desperate. The Mustang looked like an easy solution, a valuable asset, a quick source of cash, a problem solver. What neither of them seemed willing to acknowledge was a simple fact. The Mustang wasn't theirs. Apparently that didn't matter. According to Ethan, Brian spread several documents across the kitchen table that evening. Estimated vehicle values, classic car auction records, market reports, numbers. Lots of numbers. The figures were impressive. Some restored Mustangs had sold for enormous amounts. Far more than Melissa expected. Far more than Ethan expected. And certainly far more than Brian needed to convince them. "Your mother doesn't even drive it much anymore," Brian reportedly said. "She's keeping money locked in a garage." Melissa didn't argue. That fact hurt me almost as much as everything else, because at some point she stopped seeing the Mustang as her father's memory and started seeing it as a financial opportunity. The discussion continued for hours. Eventually, they reached a conclusion. They would sell the car while I was gone. Then they would tell me afterward. If I became upset, they would claim they acted in my best interest. If I objected, they would argue that I no longer needed it. And if necessary, they would pressure me emotionally until I accepted the situation. The plan sounds ridiculous now, but greed has a way of making people feel smarter than they actually are. The next step involved paperwork. This was where Ethan became important, because Ethan knew things. He knew where my filing cabinets were located. He knew where I stored records. He knew details that outsiders would never know. According to what later came out, Ethan initially hesitated. At least a little. But hesitation disappeared quickly when Brian started discussing how much money everyone might receive. The promise of easy money has destroyed many good decisions. Unfortunately, Ethan was no exception. Several days later, he entered my house using the spare key he already possessed. Melissa came with him. Brian arrived shortly afterward. The three of them searched through my office, my bedroom, storage cabinets, everywhere. Eventually, they found what they wanted: copies of vehicle records, registration information, insurance documents. They didn't find the current title, because the current title no longer existed in my filing cabinet. It had already been legally transferred through Samuel's office. But they didn't know that. Instead, they found older paperwork, enough to convince themselves they had everything necessary. At some point during the search, Ethan located the spare Mustang key, the same key I had discovered missing weeks earlier. Suddenly, all those warning signs made sense. It hadn't disappeared accidentally. Someone had taken it. Someone had planned ahead. The realization would later make me physically ill, because theft is painful, but theft committed by family carries a different kind of wound. After gathering documents, Brian contacted a classic car dealer in Columbus. His name was Frank Reynolds. Frank had been buying and selling collector vehicles for decades. By all accounts, he was an honest businessman. The problem was that honest businessmen can still be deceived, especially when presented with convincing lies. Brian told Frank a carefully crafted story. The owner was elderly. The family had authority to assist. The car needed to be sold quickly. Everyone agreed. Everything was legitimate, at least according to Brian. Frank arranged an inspection. When he saw the Mustang, he immediately recognized its value. The restoration quality alone impressed him. The vehicle was in excellent condition, well-maintained, properly documented, exactly the kind of car collectors wanted. Negotiations moved quickly, too quickly. That should have been a warning sign. But when people smell profit, warnings often become invisible. A tentative agreement was reached. The Mustang would be sold. Frank would arrange a future resale to a private collector. Everyone involved expected to make money. Everyone believed the deal was moving forward. The most astonishing part, not one of them checked the current title status. Not Frank, not Brian, not Melissa, not Ethan. No one. They simply assumed ownership remained exactly where it had always been, with me. That assumption would eventually destroy everything. By the second week of my stay in Michigan, the deal was already progressing. Paperwork circulated. Phone calls were made. Money discussions intensified. At one point, Brian reportedly began talking about paying off debts. Melissa discussed home repairs. Ethan talked about upgrading his car and covering school expenses. They were already spending money in their minds, money they didn't actually possess, money connected to a vehicle they didn't legally control. Meanwhile, I remained completely unaware, or at least mostly unaware, because intuition is a strange thing. One evening, while helping Patricia prepare dinner, I suddenly felt overwhelmed by anxiety. No reason, no explanation, just a feeling. Patricia noticed immediately. "You okay?" I forced a smile. "Just tired." She studied me. "We've been friends a long time, Jerry." I laughed softly. "That obvious?" Something's bothering you. I hesitated. Then I told her about Melissa, about Brian, about Ethan, about the trust, about everything. Patricia listened quietly. When I finished, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I think you did the right thing. I hope so. No, she said firmly. I know so. I wanted to believe her, and deep down I think I already did. What neither of us knew was that events back home were approaching a point of no return. Contracts were being prepared, promises were being made, and 3 members of my family were becoming increasingly confident. They believed their plan had succeeded. They believed the Mustang would soon be gone. They believed I would return home with no choice but to accept it. What they didn't realize was that one missing piece of information, the most important piece, was about to turn their entire scheme into a legal nightmare. And when I finally walked back into my garage, they would discover exactly how expensive assumptions can become. 3 weeks after leaving Ohio, I finally began the drive home. Patricia's recovery had gone well. She was walking without assistance. Her doctors were pleased with her progress, and although she still had a long road ahead, she no longer needed me there every day. The night before I left, we sat on her back porch watching the sunset. I don't know what I would have done without you, she said. I smiled. You would have managed. No, she replied firmly. I wouldn't have. We sat quietly for a moment. Then she gave me a look that told me she was thinking about something else. You're worried about going home. I didn't answer immediately, because she was right. The closer I got to returning to Ohio, the more uneasy I felt. Not terrified, not exactly, just unsettled, like a storm was waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. I think everything will be fine, I finally said. Patricia raised an eyebrow. That's not what you believe. I laughed softly. No? It rarely helps to ignore your instincts. Those words stayed with me during the entire drive home. 8 hours on the road. 8 hours alone with my thoughts. 8 hours replaying every warning sign I had seen before leaving. By the time I reached my neighborhood, the sun was beginning to set. Everything looked normal. The same houses, the same trees, the same quiet streets. Nothing appeared different, but appearances can be deceiving. As I pulled into my driveway, something immediately felt wrong. I couldn't identify it at first. Then I realized. The garage door was closed. That wasn't unusual. The problem was what I didn't see. Normally, through a small side window, I could glimpse the front corner of the Mustang. This time, I couldn't. A strange chill moved through me. I parked, stepped out of my SUV, walked toward the garage. My heartbeat accelerated. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe the angle was different. Maybe the lighting was playing tricks on me. I unlocked the side entrance, opened the door, and froze. The garage was empty. The Mustang was gone. For several seconds, I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't breathe. The space where the car had sat for decades was simply empty. The concrete floor seemed larger somehow, colder, wrong. My eyes searched the room automatically. Maybe it had been moved. Maybe someone borrowed it. Maybe there was some explanation. But deep down, I already knew. I turned and walked back toward the house. Slowly, deliberately. My hands trembled. Inside, I found Melissa sitting at the kitchen table. Brian stood near the counter. Ethan was scrolling through his phone on the living room sofa. All 3 looked up when I entered. For a brief moment, nobody spoke. Then Melissa smiled. The smile immediately told me she knew. "Mom," she said. I stared at her. Where's the Mustang? The smile disappeared. Not because she felt guilty, because she had prepared for this conversation. Please don't get upset. My stomach dropped. That sentence alone told me everything. Melissa. She took a deep breath. We sold it. Silence filled the room. A strange silence. The kind that exists when reality suddenly changes shape. I looked from Melissa to Brian, then to Ethan. None of them appeared shocked. None of them appeared confused. They had expected this moment, planned for it. We sold it, Melissa repeated. As if saying it twice somehow made it reasonable. I felt a sharp ache in my chest. Not because of the car, not yet. Because of the betrayal, the certainty, the arrogance, the assumption that they had the right. Sold it. My voice sounded calm, far calmer than I felt. Brian stepped forward. We did what was best. Best. That word almost made me laugh. Best for who? His expression tightened. For everyone. Melissa nodded. You hardly drive it anymore. Ethan finally looked up from his phone. Grandma, it's just a car. Just a car. The words hit harder than I expected. Because Ethan knew better. He knew exactly what that Mustang meant. Or at least he used to. I looked around the room. 3 people. 3 faces I had loved for years. And suddenly I felt as though I barely knew them. How much? Brian answered immediately. The speed of his response told me he had rehearsed it. The number itself didn't matter. What mattered was what came next. We haven't received all the money yet. Interesting. Not received all the money, which meant they had already received some. I noticed Ethan glance toward the expensive new phone in his hand, a phone I didn't remember seeing before my trip. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. Melissa leaned forward. Mom, please understand. I said nothing. She continued. You don't need that car anymore. Need. As if memories required justification, as if grief needed practical value, as if love could be measured in usefulness. Brian joined in. The money can help the family. There it was. The truth. Not safety. Not concern. Not my well-being. Money. Always money. I studied their faces carefully, and suddenly something remarkable happened. The anger I expected never arrived. Instead, a strange calm settled over me. Perhaps because I had already prepared myself. Perhaps because Samuel had been right. Perhaps because deep down I had seen this coming. Melissa seemed confused by my reaction. She expected shouting, tears, maybe even panic. Instead, I pulled out a chair and sat down. Nobody spoke. The room felt tense, uncomfortable. Then I asked a very simple question. Who bought it? Brian answered. A collector through a dealer in Columbus. I nodded. And you completed the sale? Yes. Another nod. And you signed paperwork? Melissa exchanged a glance with Brian. Of course. Interesting. Very interesting. I folded my hands together, still calm, still quiet. The 3 of them seemed increasingly uncertain, because the scene wasn't unfolding the way they expected. Finally, Melissa frowned. Aren't you going to say anything? I looked directly at her. I am. The room went silent again. Every eye focused on me. I took a slow breath, then asked the question that changed everything. How exactly did you sell property that didn't belong to me anymore? The effect was immediate. Melissa blinked. Brian froze. Ethan lowered his phone. For several seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. It was as though all the air had been sucked from the room. Brian recovered first. "What are you talking about?" I held his gaze. "The Mustang." Melissa laughed nervously. "It belonged to you." "No." I shook my head. "It didn't." Now they were staring, completely confused, completely blindsided. The confidence that had filled the room only moments earlier was beginning to disappear. Brian's face paled slightly. "What do you mean it didn't belong to you?" I stood slowly. Every movement felt deliberate, controlled, measured. Because for the first time since entering that empty garage, I understood something. The balance of power had changed. Not in their favor, in mine. And they didn't even realize it yet. "I mean," I said quietly, "that nearly a month ago, before I left Ohio, I legally transferred ownership." Melissa stared at me. Brian stared at me. Even Ethan looked frightened now. "Transferred it to who?" Melissa whispered. I reached into my purse, removed a folder, and placed it on the table. "The Robert Cruz Memorial Trust." Nobody touched the folder. Nobody spoke. The silence lasted so long that I could hear the clock ticking in the living room. Then Brian finally asked the question I had been waiting for, a question that revealed he was beginning to understand just how serious this situation had become. "Geraldine." His voice sounded different now, less confident, more worried. "What exactly does that mean?" I looked directly into his eyes, and for the first time since returning home, I allowed myself a small smile. Because within the next 24 hours, all three of them were about to find out. The silence that followed my announcement was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Not the comfortable silence of family dinners, not the peaceful silence of an early morning. This was the silence of people realizing they might have made a terrible mistake. Melissa was the first to speak. "What trust?" Her voice sounded smaller than usual, less certain, less confident. I slid the folder across the table. No one touched it. "The Robert Cruz Memorial Trust." Brian stared at the papers as if they might disappear. "You're serious?" "Very." Ethan shifted uncomfortably on the sofa. His confidence from earlier had vanished completely. For several moments, nobody said anything. Then Brian laughed. A nervous laugh. The kind people use when they're trying to convince themselves everything is still under control. "Okay," he said. "Maybe ownership changed on paper. That's fine. We can sort it out." I looked directly at him. "No, you don't understand." His smile faded. "The car wasn't mine to sell." The words landed heavily. Melissa swallowed. "What does that mean?" "It means the person who sold it had no legal authority." I watched the realization begin spreading across their faces, slowly, painfully, like a crack moving through glass. Brian immediately shifted into defense mode. "There has to be some misunderstanding." "There isn't. People transfer things into trusts all the time." "Yes, and families handle those assets. Only when they're authorized." Another silence. Then Melissa suddenly stood. "Mom, we're your family." The statement sounded almost desperate, as if that changes the law. I asked quietly. She looked wounded, but for the first time that evening, I wasn't interested in protecting her feelings, because nobody in that room had protected mine. Before anyone could respond, my phone rang. I glanced at the screen. Samuel Bennett. The timing could not have been more perfect. I answered on speaker. "Hello, Samuel." "Geraldine." His voice remained calm and professional. "Have you arrived home safely?" "Yes." I glanced around the room. "My family is here." "I see." Samuel paused briefly, then continued. "I received a phone call this afternoon that you should know about." Now everyone was listening. Every face had turned pale. "What kind of phone call?" I asked. "A dealership in Columbus contacted my office." Brian's shoulders visibly stiffened. Melissa closed her eyes. Ethan looked ready to disappear. Samuel continued. "They were attempting to verify ownership records for a 1967 Ford Mustang." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. "The dealership discovered that the current ownership information did not match the documents they were provided." The room seemed to shrink. Samuel's next sentence hit like a hammer. "They are extremely concerned." Brian looked as though someone had punched him. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "What happens now?" I asked. The dealer requested a copy of the trust documentation. "And we provided confirmation that the trust owns the vehicle." Samuel paused again, then added, "They have suspended the transaction." Melissa gasped. Brian muttered a curse under his breath. Ethan stared at the floor. The transaction. Suspended. In a single word, their entire plan had begun collapsing. After ending the call, I placed my phone on the table. No one spoke for nearly a minute. Then Brian suddenly exploded. "You transferred it without telling anyone." The accusation was so ridiculous that I almost laughed. Instead, I stared at him. "You searched my house without permission." His mouth snapped shut. Melissa stepped in quickly. "Mom, nobody searched your house." I turned toward her. "Really?" She hesitated. That hesitation told me everything. Then I asked the question, a simple question, one that changed the entire conversation. "If nobody searched the house, how did Ethan find the paperwork?" Every head turned toward Ethan. The young man immediately looked terrified. No one answered. I repeated the question. "How did he find it?" Ethan swallowed hard. Still no answer. Brian spoke instead. "Leave him out of this." "No." For the first time all evening, my voice hardened. "No, Brian, I won't." Because I already knew. I knew from the missing key, the disturbed files, the suspicious questions. I knew someone had accessed my records. Now I wanted them to say it, out loud. The room remained silent, until another sound interrupted. My home's security system. A notification appeared on my phone. One of the outdoor cameras had recorded movement. Samuel had convinced me 2 years earlier to install cameras around the property. I rarely checked them. Tonight I did. And suddenly an idea occurred to me. I opened the security application, scanned through older recordings, then stopped. A particular date caught my attention. A date during my trip. The timestamp showed activity near the garage. My pulse quickened. I tapped the video. The footage loaded. Everyone watched. And there on the screen was Ethan, entering the garage, looking around, moving directly toward the storage cabinet. Nobody spoke. The recording continued. A few minutes later, Ethan emerged holding a file folder. My file folder. The same one containing vehicle records. The room went dead silent. Melissa covered her mouth. Brian looked away. Ethan's face turned bright red. "Grandma," his voice cracked. I didn't answer. The video answered for him. The footage clearly showed him removing documents, then returning them later. The evidence was undeniable. Samuel's words from weeks earlier suddenly echoed in my mind. Protect yourself if you're right. At the time, I hadn't fully understood. Now I did. Because suspicion is one thing, proof is another, and now I had proof. Ethan started crying. Not dramatic tears, not manipulative tears. Real tears. The kind born from fear. I didn't think, no. I interrupted. You didn't. His shoulders shook. Brian immediately stepped forward. This was my idea. Melissa looked at him. Shock flashed across her face. Then anger. What? Brian rubbed his forehead. I told him where to look. Now Melissa looked ready to cry too. Everything was unraveling, exactly as greed always does. One lie revealing another. One secret exposing the next. Then came the final twist. My phone rang again. This time the caller ID displayed an unfamiliar number. I answered. Hello? A man's voice responded. Mrs. Cruz? Yes. My name is Frank Reynolds. The dealership owner. The room instantly froze again. Frank sounded exhausted, worried, embarrassed. Mrs. Cruz, I believe we need to speak. I think so too, he sighed heavily. After reviewing the information from your attorney, we've identified serious problems with the sale. Serious problems. That was one way to describe it. The vehicle remains at our facility. I felt a wave of relief. At least the Mustang hadn't disappeared. Not yet. Frank continued. I'd like to cooperate fully in resolving this matter. I glanced at Brian. His face had gone completely white. Then Frank delivered the sentence that finally shattered whatever hope remained. We also need to discuss the documents that were presented during the transaction. The documents. Plural. Not document. Documents. Something in his tone told me there was more. Much more. And whatever Frank had discovered was serious enough to make a veteran dealer call personally. After ending the conversation, I looked around the room one final time. Melissa looked devastated. Ethan looked terrified. Brian looked trapped. For the first time since coming home, they understood the truth. This wasn't a family disagreement anymore. This wasn't an argument about a car. This was becoming a legal problem. A very serious legal problem. And the worst part for them, the investigation had only just begun. I barely slept that night. Not because I was worried. Oddly enough, the worry had begun to fade. What kept me awake was something else. Disappointment. The kind that settles deep inside your chest and refuses to leave. For years I had worried about strangers, scammers, thieves, people looking for opportunities to take advantage of older adults. I never imagined I would need protection from my own family. Around 6 a.m, I was already awake and drinking coffee when my phone rang. It was Samuel Bennett. Good morning, Geraldine. Morning? You ready for a trip? I laughed softly. Not particularly. Frank Reynolds wants to meet today? That didn't surprise me. After the previous night's phone call, I had expected it. When? 10 o'clock. I glanced out the window. That gave me just enough time to prepare. I'll be there. Samuel paused, then added quietly, Bring patience. That warning turned out to be very good advice. 2 hours later, Samuel and I were driving toward Columbus. The entire trip felt strangely surreal. A month earlier, I had been worried about a missing key. Now I was driving to retrieve a car my own family had attempted to sell. Life can change quickly. The dealership sat on the edge of the city, large, professional, filled with collector vehicles worth more money than I cared to imagine. As we parked, I noticed a black SUV already waiting near the entrance. Frank Reynolds stepped outside the moment he saw us. He looked tired, much older than he had sounded on the phone. The expression on his face told me he had not enjoyed the last 24 hours. "Mrs. Cruz." He extended his hand. "I'm very sorry." The apology sounded genuine. I shook his hand. "I appreciate that." Frank looked genuinely relieved that I wasn't screaming at him. Truthfully, I didn't blame him. Not entirely. He had been misled. That didn't erase his responsibility, but it wasn't the same as what Melissa Bryan and Ethan had done. Frank led us into his office. Stacks of paperwork covered his desk. Vehicle records, transaction files, ownership documents. I immediately noticed a thick folder labeled Cruz Mustang. Not exactly the kind of fame I wanted. Once we sat down, Frank got straight to the point. "The moment your attorney sent over the trust documentation, we stopped everything." Samuel nodded. "That was the appropriate decision." Frank rubbed his forehead. "I wish we'd caught it sooner." "So do I," Samuel replied. The dealer winced slightly. Apparently, Samuel wasn't interested in making him feel better. Neither was I. Frank opened the folder. Several documents lay inside. Some were legitimate. Some were not. And that's when I saw it. A signature. My signature, or at least an imitation of it. My stomach turned. For a few seconds, I simply stared. The signature looked convincing from a distance, but up close, the differences were obvious. The angle, the spacing, the pressure patterns. Someone had tried to copy my handwriting. Someone in my family. I felt suddenly cold. Frank watched my reaction carefully. "Mrs. Cruz, can you confirm that you did not sign these?" I looked directly at him. "I absolutely did not." He nodded. "As I suspected." The room grew quiet. Samuel carefully reviewed each page. His expression darkened. Finally, he placed the documents on the desk. "These are serious problems." Frank sighed. "I know." And he truly did know. Because this wasn't merely a failed transaction anymore. The moment forged documents entered the picture, everything became much more complicated. For several minutes, the discussion focused on legal procedures, corrective filings, ownership verification, transaction cancellation, insurance protections. I listened, but only partially. My thoughts kept drifting elsewhere. Back to my family, back to Melissa. I kept asking myself the same question. When had she crossed this line? At what point had my daughter decided that deception was acceptable? At what point had money become more important than integrity? I didn't have answers. Maybe I never would. Eventually, Frank stood. "I think you should see the car." For the first time all morning, my heart lifted. The Mustang. I hadn't seen it since before leaving Ohio. Frank led us through a large warehouse area. Rows of classic vehicles filled the building. Corvettes, Camaros, Thunderbirds, Mustangs, dozens of beautiful machines. And then I saw it. My Mustang, sitting exactly where it belonged. Untouched. Safe. For a moment, I couldn't move. Emotion caught me completely off guard. I walked slowly toward it. Ran my hand along the driver's side door, the familiar paint, the familiar chrome, the familiar memories. I suddenly felt tears forming, not because of the car itself, Because of Robert. Because despite everything that had happened, this piece of him was still here, still waiting, still mine, or rather, still ours. Samuel quietly stepped back, giving me a moment alone. I appreciated that. Some moments don't need witnesses. After several minutes, I opened the driver's door. The interior looked exactly as I remembered. The scent of old leather greeted me immediately. For a brief second, it felt as though Robert might appear beside me and complain about someone touching his engine. I smiled despite myself. Then something unexpected caught my attention. A small metal box, tucked beneath a storage panel inside the trunk compartment. My smile faded. I frowned. That box didn't belong there, or at least I didn't remember it being there. Samuel, he walked over. "What is it?" I pointed. Neither of us recognized the box. Frank looked equally confused. Carefully, I lifted it out. It wasn't large. About the size of a shoebox. Old. Dust-covered. Clearly hidden years earlier. My pulse quickened. Robert had always been the kind of man who tucked things away. Notes, tools, photographs, memories. But I had never seen this box before. Not once, and I knew this car better than almost anyone. The lock had long since rusted. With Frank's permission, we carefully opened it. The lid creaked as it lifted. Inside sat several envelopes, a stack of photographs, and what appeared to be a leather-bound journal. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The contents looked old. Very old. The envelopes were addressed in Robert's handwriting. I recognized it immediately. My hands began shaking. After all these years, seeing his handwriting still affected me, more than I cared to admit. One envelope had a simple message written across the front. For Geraldine. My breath caught. The warehouse suddenly felt silent, far quieter than before. I carefully picked up the envelope. The paper felt fragile, almost sacred. Samuel quietly stepped back again. Frank looked away respectfully. Even he seemed to understand this wasn't merely paperwork. This was something personal, something important, something Robert had intended to be found one day. But perhaps not this way. Not after an attempted theft. Not after a betrayal. Not in the middle of a legal disaster. Yet somehow it felt appropriate. Because while my family had been chasing money, Robert had left something far more valuable. A message. A truth. A legacy. And judging by the number of letters inside that box, there was far more to discover than any of us realized. I looked down at the envelope. My husband's handwriting stared back at me from across the years. Suddenly retrieving the Mustang no longer felt like the most important thing that had happened that day, because I had a feeling Robert was about to speak to me one more time, and whatever he had left behind was about to change everything. I didn't open the letter immediately. For several moments I simply held it. My thumb traced the familiar handwriting on the front of the envelope. For Geraldine. Just 3 words, yet seeing them felt like hearing Robert's voice after years of silence. The warehouse around me seemed to disappear. The dealership, the legal problems, the betrayal. For a brief moment, none of it mattered. All I could think about was the man I had loved for 42 years. Samuel gently touched my shoulder. "We can take these somewhere private." I nodded. A few minutes later, we were sitting in a small conference room inside the dealership. The metal box rested on the table between us. Frank Reynolds had excused himself. Samuel sat quietly nearby, giving me space. The room felt strangely sacred, almost like a chapel. With trembling fingers, I opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. The paper had yellowed slightly with age, but the writing remained clear. The moment I saw Robert's handwriting, tears filled my eyes. I began reading. My dearest Jerry, if you're reading this, it means life has continued without me longer than either of us wanted. And if that's true, then the first thing I need you to know is that I loved every single day we had together. I stopped, closed my eyes, and cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly. The kind of tears that come from love rather than pain. After a moment, I continued. The letter spoke about our life together, the first apartment we shared, the struggles when money was tight, the long nights in the garage restoring the Mustang, the road trips, the birthdays, the ordinary moments that become extraordinary memories once they're gone. Every paragraph felt like a conversation, like Robert was sitting across from me, smiling, telling stories, being himself. Then the tone changed. The words became more serious, and that's when I discovered why the box existed. There's something I've never fully discussed with anyone, Robert wrote. Not even you, because I wasn't sure the right time would ever come. My heart began racing. I kept reading. Several years before his death, Robert had quietly started developing an idea. A dream, really, one he never completed, one he hoped someone else might someday finish. He wanted to create a scholarship fund, not for academic achievement, not for elite universities, but for young people pursuing skilled trades, future mechanics, electricians, welders, people who worked with their hands, people like him. Robert believed America desperately needed more skilled workers, and he worried those careers were being overlooked. He wanted to help change that. The letter explained everything. The Mustang had always been part of that vision, not because he wanted it sold, but because he believed it could inspire something larger, a symbol, a starting point, a legacy. By the time I finished the letter, I could barely see through my tears. Samuel quietly handed me a tissue. Neither of us spoke. For several minutes, I simply sat there, thinking, remembering, missing him. Then I opened the next envelope, and the next, and the next. Each contained another piece of Robert's thoughts. His hopes, his reflections, his dreams for the future. Some letters were addressed to me. Others were addressed to Melissa. One was even addressed to Ethan, though he had written it when Ethan was still a child. The photographs told their own story. Pictures from our early years, garage projects, family vacations, Melissa sitting inside the Mustang at age 6, Robert teaching Ethan how to hold a wrench, smiling faces frozen in time, moments nobody expected would become so precious. Then I reached the journal. Unlike the letters, the journal appeared more personal, more private. At first I hesitated. Part of me wondered whether I should read it at all, but another part knew Robert had intentionally hidden it alongside the letters. He wanted it found. Eventually, so I opened it. The entries covered several years, not daily records, just occasional reflections, thoughts, concerns, observations. Most were ordinary. Until I reached an entry dated about 3 years before Robert died. That was when everything changed. The entry mentioned Melissa, specifically her growing attitude toward money. I read it twice because I couldn't believe it. Robert had noticed the same thing I was seeing now, long before I recognized it myself. His words were careful, never cruel, never angry, but honest. painfully honest. "Melissa has a good heart," he wrote. "But lately, I worry she's measuring success by dollars instead of character." My chest tightened. I kept reading. Robert described several incidents involving finances, arguments, entitlement, a tendency to see assets before relationships. He wasn't condemning her. He was worried about her, trying to understand her, trying to help her. Then came a sentence that made me set the journal down. "If anything ever happens to me, I hope Jerry remembers that protecting what matters isn't the same as being selfish." I stared at the page. Protecting what matters. The words echoed in my mind, because that's exactly what I had done. Without knowing it, without ever reading these pages before, I had protected the Mustang, protected Robert's legacy, protected something valuable, not because of greed, because of love. Suddenly, the entire situation felt different. Until that moment, the fight over the Mustang had seemed like a battle about ownership. Now I realized it was something much larger. It was about values, about legacy, about what survives after we're gone. While Brian saw a payday, Robert saw opportunity. While Melissa saw money, Robert saw purpose. While Ethan saw a valuable object, Robert saw inspiration. The contrast broke my heart, yet it also gave me clarity. A few hours later, Samuel and I returned to Ohio. The box came with us. I spent most of the drive reading, thinking, remembering. By the time we reached my house, I knew something with absolute certainty. The trust would remain. The Mustang would remain protected, and Robert's dream would move forward. Somehow, some way. That evening, I sat alone in the garage beside the Mustang, the same place where Robert and I had spent countless hours together, the same place where so many memories had been created. I placed the letters beside me. Then I looked at the car. For the first time since discovering the betrayal, I felt peace. Not complete peace. There was still legal trouble ahead, still painful conversations, still consequences waiting to unfold. But beneath all of that, there was peace, because I finally understood what Robert had left behind. Not a car, not money, a mission, a purpose, a legacy. The next morning, however, reality returned quickly. Samuel called before breakfast. His tone was serious. "Geraldine, we need to discuss the next steps." I already knew what that meant. The documents, the forged signature, the unauthorized sale, the investigation, consequences. Samuel explained that formal notices were being prepared. The dealership had provided copies of everything, every document, every communication, every signature. The evidence was extensive, more extensive than any of us had realized. And unfortunately for Brian, much of it pointed directly toward him. When I hung up, I stared out the kitchen window for a long time. Part of me felt sorrow. Another part felt relief, because truth was finally catching up with deception. No matter how much someone tries to hide it, the truth eventually arrives. Always. The only question is how much damage has already been done when it gets there. And soon my family would discover exactly what happens when greed collides with consequences. The following week became one of the most difficult weeks of my life. Not because of lawyers, not because of paperwork, not even because of the Mustang. It was difficult because I had to watch people I loved face the consequences of their own choices. And no matter how justified those consequences were, it still hurt. Samuel Bennett moved quickly. Within days, formal notices had been sent. The The dealership had submitted copies of every document involved in the attempted transaction: the forged signatures, the ownership representations, the communications, everything. For the first time, Brian Carter was forced to confront the reality of what he had done. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a family dispute. It wasn't an argument about a car. The situation had crossed into legal territory. Very serious legal territory. I wasn't interested in sending anyone to jail. That was never my goal. But I also wasn't willing to lie. And I certainly wasn't willing to shield people from the consequences of their actions, especially after they had shown so little concern for mine. 3 days after Samuel sent the notices, Melissa called. Her voice sounded exhausted. "Mom, can we talk?" I closed my eyes. For months she had talked at me. Now she finally wanted to talk with me. "When?" "Today." I agreed. That evening, Melissa arrived alone. No Brian, no Ethan, just her. For the first few minutes, neither of us spoke. She sat at the kitchen table where she had announced the sale of the Mustang. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Finally, she broke the silence. "I never thought it would go this far." I studied her face. She looked older, not physically, emotionally, like reality had finally reached her. "What exactly did you think would happen?" I asked quietly. Her eyes filled with tears. "I don't know." That answer was probably the most honest thing she had said in months, because people rarely think about consequences when they're chasing what they want. They only think about rewards. Melissa stared down at her hands. "I thought we were helping." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was absurd. "Helping who?" She had no answer. Neither did I. A long silence followed. Then Melissa finally whispered something I never expected to hear. "Dad would be ashamed of me." The words hit hard. Harder than anger. Harder than accusations. Because she was right. And deep down, she knew it. Tears rolled down her cheeks. For the first time, I saw genuine regret. Not fear. Not self-preservation. Regret. There is a difference. A very important difference. Before I could respond, another car pulled into the driveway. Brian. A few seconds later, Ethan followed. Apparently, they had decided to come together after all. The atmosphere changed immediately. Melissa looked nervous. Ethan looked miserable. Brian looked defeated. We all sat down around the same table where our family had celebrated birthdays, Christmas dinners, graduations, and now this. No one spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, Brian cleared his throat. "I owe you an apology." I waited. He looked directly at me. "I started this." The confession surprised me. Not because I doubted it, because I never expected him to admit it. "I was drowning financially." He swallowed hard. "I convinced myself the Mustang could solve everything." I listened without interrupting. For once, he wasn't making excuses. "I kept telling myself it wasn't really stealing." His voice broke slightly. "I told myself you would understand afterward." There it was. The lie people tell themselves when they're about to do something wrong. The belief that future forgiveness somehow justifies present betrayal. It doesn't. Never has. Never will. Brian lowered his eyes. "I was wrong." For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Then I remembered the forged signature, the lies, the manipulation, the planning, and my sympathy faded. Actions matter. Intentions matter. But choices matter too. Ethan spoke next. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry, Grandma." I looked at my grandson, the boy I had once taught to ride a bicycle, the boy Robert had taught to hold a wrench, the boy who used to bring me flowers from the yard. Now he looked broken. "I shouldn't have taken the documents." "No," I agreed quietly. "I shouldn't have lied." "No, I shouldn't have listened." I stared at him for several seconds, then asked the question I had been carrying for weeks. "Why did you—" His eyes filled with tears immediately, because sometimes the simplest questions are the hardest to answer. Finally, he spoke. "I wanted them to be proud of me." The room fell silent. Melissa started crying again. Brian looked away, and suddenly I understood something. Ethan hadn't been driven primarily by greed. He had been driven by approval, the desire to belong, the desire to please his parents. That didn't excuse what he did, but it explained it, and understanding matters. For the next hour, truths emerged that had remained hidden for years. Melissa admitted she had been worried about money for a long time. Brian admitted the full extent of his debt. It was far worse than anyone realized. Even Melissa. Failed investments, bad decisions, loans, credit cards. The hole had become enormous. And instead of confronting it honestly, Brian had searched for shortcuts. The Mustang became that shortcut. Or so he believed. By the end of the conversation, everyone looked emotionally exhausted, including me. Finally, Brian asked the question none of them wanted to ask. "What happens now?" I took a deep breath. The answer mattered. Not just for them. For me too. Because this was the moment when I had to decide what kind of person I wanted to be. Bitter or strong. There is a difference. A profound difference. "I won't lie for you." My words were calm, steady, final. Nobody argued. "I won't interfere with the legal process." Again, nobody argued, because they knew I was right. Then I continued. "But I also won't spend the rest of my life trying to destroy you." That got their attention. All three looked up. Hope flickered across their faces. Not relief. Hope. A small but important distinction. "Whatever consequences come," I said, "you will face them honestly." I looked at Brian. "You created this." Then Melissa. "You participated." Then Ethan. "You helped." Each of them nodded, slowly, painfully, but honestly. For the first time in a very long time, honesty had entered the room, not because anyone wanted it, because there was no alternative left. Before leaving, Ethan handed me something, a folded piece of paper. "I wrote this." I unfolded it. It was a letter, an apology, not a text message, not a quick excuse, a real letter, handwritten, thoughtful, sincere. I didn't read it immediately, but I appreciated the effort. After they left, I sat alone in the kitchen. The house felt quiet again, peaceful. Outside, the sun was beginning to set. I thought about Robert, about the letters, about the trust, about the scholarship dream hidden inside that metal box. And suddenly I realized something important. The Mustang had never really been the center of this story. It only looked that way. The real story was about choices, values, character, legacy, and now with the legal issues nearing resolution, I knew exactly what needed to happen next. Robert's dream would finally become reality. The Mustang would help create something meaningful, something lasting, something far more valuable than money. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt genuine hope about the future. 6 months later, my life looked very different. Not perfect, not magically repaired, but different. In many ways, better. The legal situation eventually resolved itself without becoming the nightmare everyone feared. Because once the evidence was presented, the facts were undeniable. The attempted sale was void. The forged documents were identified. The ownership records were corrected. The Mustang remained exactly where it belonged. Inside the Robert Cruz Memorial Trust, there were consequences, of course. Brian faced significant financial penalties and legal expenses. The experience forced him to confront years of irresponsible decisions. For the first time in a very long time, he stopped looking for shortcuts, stopped looking for someone else to rescue him, stopped believing that another person's property could solve his problems. Melissa had consequences too, not legal ones, something harder. The loss of trust. Trust takes years to build, minutes to destroy, and a very long time to rebuild. To her credit, she understood that. She never demanded immediate forgiveness, never insisted that everything return to normal. Instead, she did something far more difficult. She accepted responsibility, one day at a time, one conversation at a time, one honest choice at a time. As for Ethan, his university reviewed the situation. Fortunately, because he cooperated fully and had no prior issues, the outcome was educational rather than devastating. Still, the experience changed him, perhaps more than anyone else. Several weeks after our family meeting, I finally read the apology letter he had handed me. I still keep it in my desk drawer. Part of it reads, "I spent so much time trying to prove I was grown up that I forgot what being a good man actually means. Grandpa would be disappointed in what I did, but I hope someday he would be proud of who I become." When I first read those words, I cried. Not because they erased what happened, they didn't, but because they showed something important. Growth. Real growth. And growth always deserves a chance. Meanwhile, Robert's letters continued changing my life. I read them repeatedly. Some nights I would sit in the garage beside the Mustang and read them all over again. Each time I discovered something new. A memory, a lesson, a detail I had overlooked. But one message appeared again and again. Legacy matters. Not the legacy of money, not the legacy of possessions, the legacy of impact, the difference you leave behind in other people's lives. Eventually, I realized I could no longer postpone Robert's dream. The scholarship fund needed to become real, not someday, now. With Samuel's help, the Robert Cruz Memorial Scholarship Fund was officially established. Its purpose was simple: support young people pursuing skilled trades, future mechanics, welders, electricians, automotive technicians, the very careers Robert had respected throughout his life. At first, the project was small, very small. A few local donors, some community support, several businesses willing to help. But momentum grew quickly. People responded to the story, not the family drama, the dream behind it, the belief that skilled work deserves respect, the belief that opportunity changes lives, the belief that ordinary people can create extraordinary legacies. Then came the idea that changed everything: the Mustang. Instead of hiding it away, we decided to make it the symbol of the scholarship program. The centerpiece, the reminder, the living connection to Robert's story. Every fundraising event featured the car. Every brochure included its photograph. Every scholarship recipient learned why it mattered. The response exceeded every expectation. 1 year after finding the letters, we held our largest fundraising event yet. More than 200 people attended. Local businesses sponsored tables, students brought their families, community leaders spoke, and parked directly in front of the venue sat Robert's beloved Mustang. Polished, beautiful, timeless, exactly as he would have wanted. I stood beside it greeting guests. For the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't experienced since losing Robert. Peace. Not because I stopped missing him. I never will. But because I finally understood something. Love doesn't disappear when people die. It changes form. It becomes memory. It becomes influence. It becomes legacy. Late that afternoon, someone approached me. Ethan. He looked nervous, much like he had the day he handed me his apology letter. Grandma. Yes. He smiled awkwardly, then handed me another envelope. What's this? Open it later. I laughed. Should I be worried? No. For the first time in a long time, his smile looked genuine. That evening, after everyone had gone home, I opened the envelope. Inside was a copy of his acceptance letter, not to a university, to an automotive technology program. Attached was a handwritten note. I think Grandpa was right. Working with your hands matters. Thank you for giving me another chance. I sat quietly for a long time after reading that. Then I looked through the garage window at the Mustang and smiled, because perhaps that was Robert's greatest gift. Not the car, not the trust, not even the scholarship. Hope. Hope that people can change. Hope that mistakes don't have to define us forever. Hope that families can heal even after painful betrayals. Melissa still isn't the same person she was before all this happened. Neither is Brian. Neither is Ethan. Neither am I. We all changed. Some changes were painful. Others were necessary. But all of them taught us something valuable. The Mustang still sits in my garage. Technically, it belongs to the trust. But every time I see it, I think of Robert. I think of the young mechanic who bought a used car he could barely afford. The husband who spent 42 years making me laugh. The father who worried about his daughter. The grandfather who believed in second chances. And the man who left behind a dream hidden inside a metal box. A dream that nearly disappeared because of greed, yet survived because of love. Sometimes visitors ask whether I ever considered selling the Mustang. I always smile. Then I tell them the truth. It was never worth what people thought. They usually look confused, because they assume I'm talking about money. I'm not. I'm talking about meaning, and meaning is far more valuable than any price tag. One of the hardest lessons I've learned is that love and trust are not the same thing. We can love people deeply and still recognize when they are making harmful choices. Protecting yourself does not mean you love your family less. Sometimes it means you respect yourself enough to set boundaries. Growing older does not mean surrendering your voice, your independence, or your right to make decisions about your own life. No one should assume they know what's best for you simply because of your age. This experience also reminded me that true wealth is rarely measured in dollars. Money comes and goes. Cars age. Possessions eventually disappear. But integrity, kindness, and the impact we leave on others can last for generations. Most importantly, forgiveness and accountability can exist together. Forgiving someone does not mean pretending nothing happened. It means allowing healing while still honoring the truth. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done if your family had sold something precious behind your back? Have you ever had to choose between protecting a relationship and protecting yourself? Share your story in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe, and join our community. And don't forget to tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world.